Professor Wendy Salmond, who is a trustee of the Museum of Russian Icons. She is a professor at Chapman University. She received her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and she is regarded as one of the leading authorities in our field, both in Russian studies and icons in particular. My favorite book of hers is Treasures and Detractors, but she has written books, Arts and Crafts in Late Imperial Russia, and many other publications, too numerous to mention. She is also associated with many of our lesser competitors, including, well, I won't even mention their names because it's to dignify the other institutions. So over to you, Wendy, and you're most welcome. And thank you for curating this beautiful show.
Well, I've been waiting for this day for quite a while, and terribly sad I can't be there with you all to see the exhibition, but I could not be more thrilled that it's finally come to pass. And I want to start by making some thank yous to the really astonishing staff of the Museum of Russian Icons. I hope you all realize what an extraordinary treasure you've got there. And I want to mention the 4 people that I've worked with most closely over the last year, what absolute models of patience, tact, tolerance they have been. And I would like to recognize Amy Consalvi, Laura Garrity-Arquette, Mary Delaney and Melanie Trottier. They've just been such pleasures to work with. And it's largely thanks to them that the show has come up. So it's just, there's something about an exhibition, which is one of the most collaborative communal things you can do. And I have learned so much and gained so much from the process of working on this exhibition with you all. So thank you so much. I would say that this exhibition grew out of a dinner date, if I can be really crass about it. So a couple of years, I went to dinner with Kent and a very old friend of mine from graduate school, Nancy Norwood, who's the senior European curator at the museum, the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester. And about 10 years before that, Nancy had approached me to ask me what I thought about a portfolio of strange atheist children's alphabet drawings that a donor had offered them. And she didn't know what to do with them, or whether they were valuable, or whether a museum should have anything to do with them. It just seemed impossible to know how to characterize them and to think about them as part of a museum collection. When I saw them, because of my own unbelievably niche and arcane research interests, I recognized that this was a real treasure in disguise. And I encouraged Nancy to pitch the collection to her board, and she did. And then in 2004, she put on a beautiful little exhibition just of the anti-religious alphabet, it was called. And it was extremely well received. Then the alphabet went back into storage, as things do after exhibitions. And it wasn't until we started talking with Kent about the possibility of bringing them to Clinton that plans were hatched. So initially, I think we weren't very much more ambitious than just reprising Nancy's wonderful 2004 exhibition. But as we started to talk about it more, it became clear that there was other stories that could be added to this story. And this is what the exhibition that's just opened is. It doesn't pretend to be in any way comprehensive. There have been some wonderful comprehensive all over exhibitions of atheism in the last few years, and those have been really wonderful. What I've been interested in as the exhibition has evolved is the opportunity to bring together 3 quite random collections of atheist propaganda that were acquired by Americans traveling to the Soviet Union across the whole period of its existence. And this, to me, is what gives the exhibition, it's one of 2 things that gives the exhibition its flavor. Of course, it could be it could be a bigger exhibition, but what I think is wonderful about it is that it captures the eyewitness experience of 3 American travelers who were in the Soviet Union at different stages in the war on religion. And they were so impressed, or perhaps so awed by the power of the propaganda they saw there, they brought back what they could buy in stores as a souvenir of their visit. And this is what I think makes the exhibition so flavorful, is that in the 3 sections that you see as you walk through, the first section, which is now comes from the St. Louis University exhibitions, is a portfolio that was bought by a tourist in the 1920s and was given to the museum. The alphabet was bought by another tourist who brought it back as a souvenir of his trip in the early 1930s. And the coda of the exhibition comes from a wonderful collection of images that was gifted to Clinton's own museum, by a patron, Frank Sciacca, as a memory of his visits to the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. So in a way, they're like 3 little time warps, or perhaps slivers of time, that help us to remember the encounter of your average American tourist with this strange thing, which was the Soviet Union. And one of the strangest things about it, I think, for an American tourist, was this extraordinary, all-out, ongoing attack on faith, on religion of all kinds. So to me, that's one of the beauties of the exhibition and what I found so remarkable about it. The other aspect that I think gives it real color, and has made it such a privilege to be able to use the museum as the location, is that I'm not aware of another exhibit like this, to bring 2 enemies together in one site, if you might say, or perhaps one might say a victim and an aggressor, because by being able to bring these images, these really aggressive images, which are arguing for the destruction of all religion, and especially for the destruction of the tools of religion. And in this case, at the very center would be the icon, the cult object of orthodoxy. By bringing these into the space where icons have found a refuge from that very war on religion, you get to think about the very nitty-gritty of atheism as it's lived, and who the victim of atheism was in the Soviet Union. So I'm not in the museum. You're the first people to experience this with your members walkthrough. But I'm hoping that something will happen, or that thoughts will emerge as you walk back and forth between the icon galleries and the little gallery where the sampling of posters from a 74-year campaign against faith have found a temporary home. What makes it especially interesting for me, with my own research is very much involved in what happened to icons after the 1917 revolution. There's some kind of strange poetic justice about walking through the icon galleries. And most of those icons were somehow dislodged from their homes in Russia after 1917. And there's just this extraordinary irony of them sharing quarters for a few months with the very images which were calling for their ultimate demise and destruction. So I think those are my introductory ideas. Oh, I'll say one more thing, if I may. I would like to acknowledge that a third thing that we've tried to do in the exhibition, not just bring these slivers of time together, bring icons and their enemies into a space so we can think more thoughtfully and critically about the very notion of atheism as a state-sponsored campaign or policy. And I think the third thing is that we were very interested in finding a way, even just for a few minutes, of imagining what it might have been like to live in that environment where the sort of pervasiveness, the oppressiveness of atheism pervading public life, perhaps not private life, but certainly public life. We tried to think about this in the first section of the exhibition, where we masked posters, which normally in this country are shown in frames as separate images. And we played around with the idea of immersion, just a sliver of an idea. So what must it have been like for your space at work to have been covered with this kind of strident, aggressive messaging? And we also collaborated. I was able to collaborate with my colleague, Kevin Kane, and his colleague, Luke Coupeau, to think about virtually recreating some of those spaces. And this is what we've done in the first section with our virtual Godless Corner, to just give a sense of how these images probably were meant to be seen, to bridge a little bit of the distance of time and space, which inevitably has built up. My last comment, and I could go on till the cows come home. My last comment is that I think there's a wonderful synchronicity of timing here, that in the, not only are we very conscious at the present moment of what happens when a state launches a campaign, a media campaign, and the power that has. We're seeing this every day. But also to remember that back in the early 1930s, the American public actually was very aware of the Soviet campaign against religion. There were traveling exhibitions going through this country of atheist posters. So it's sort of interesting to think about memory and oblivion, memory and forgetting. We spent much of the 20th century forgetting, or much of the last 30 years perhaps, forgetting that this ever happened. And now we're sort of forced to wake up again and face, difficult realities around years of propaganda and force and suppression. So I think the timing for our show, I would like to think, is actually in ways that we had no idea were going to happen. It's quite a propitious moment for us to be dealing with these ideas at Clinton. Thanks, Kim.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful, wonderful comments on the exhibit, and answered some of the prepared questions that we have. So I'll skip over those. And for the audience, we have a few prepared questions for Wendy. But after those, we'll open it up if there are any audience questions about the exhibit or the subject matter. So the first of the questions is, how persuasive or successful was the move on the part of the Soviet government to persuade people to abandon their traditional Orthodox beliefs in favor of Enlightenment, science, and progress?
Well, that's I sort of need some kind of crystal ball for that. I think it's one of the big unfully answered questions about this whole campaign, that a state felt it couldn't let up on the war against religion, which I think suggests that possibly, maybe more than anything, the fact that they'd never stopped trying suggests that they were aware that they hadn't won, the war had not been won. So the fact that they were still producing massive quantities of atheist posters into the 1980s, the late 1980s, I think maybe is the best indicator of perhaps a lack of security about just what they'd been able to achieve. Yeah, there are several really interesting studies over the last few years trying to tell the larger story of Soviet atheism, and they're beginning to get at some of the nuances and the degrees of success or failure, and the waves also, the fact that this was not a consistent, steady thing, but it fluctuated over time.
That's great. So to follow up with that, the anti-religious campaign was scaled back considerably during and after World War II. So, first off, what were the reasons for that? And how did this affect the development of Soviet morality and the mood of the population towards religions?
Well, this whole sort of interregnum, this this pause, hitting the pause button during World War II, is possibly, in some ways, for many, is perhaps the way that we now know about this. The fact that the paradox that Joseph Stalin permitted and in fact encouraged a wave of return to publicly expressed religiosity, and specifically orthodoxy during the years of the war, as a form of rousing patriotic feeling in the population. Churches that had been closed were opened. Priests that had been persecuted were now allowed to preach. People that had been, if at all, worshiping in private, in secret, were now allowed and encouraged to come out publicly. There's even this amazing apocryphal story. Some of your members of the audience may know about it. There's a story that the power of icons, particularly to rally the nation in this time of external threat, was considered to be so potent and so still alive and well in the population. There's a story that that Stalin gave permission for, I think it was the Kazan Mother of God icon, to be taken up in an airplane and processed 3 times in the airspace around the city of Moscow to perform a pilgrimage of blessing and protection on the population. So the very fact, whether that happened or not, the very fact that the story exists, I think shows just how how remarkable this period was. The lid comes down and then the lid opens up again. And then pretty quickly after that, after the war is won, it's already the mid-1950s, perhaps the late 50s, that a new wave of repressive measures comes in again. So it's really quite a limited period of openness.
My last question is, during the Cold War, Soviet propaganda portrayed itself as a nation of diversity and inclusion pitted against the evils of racism and exploitation. How does this compare to the anti-religious campaigns, which lambasted many cultural traditions as dangerous superstitions?
Gosh, that's an ethical quagmire. I saw that on the end of the list of questions and I thought, boy, I'm not sure I want to answer that one. But it's a very, very important and interesting question, I acknowledge. Let he who is without sin, etc. It's clearly, I believe this is what right now is being described as whataboutism. You criticize us for this, but what about what you're doing? So that's exactly pitched at that level. America, a country of racism, Russia, a country of atheism, which is the morally more reprehensible? And I think it's raising that very, very complicated issue. And I don't really know what to say about it, depending on where you're standing, isn't it? It's depending on you. It's a very difficult question. If other people have responses to it, I would actually be really interested, because I think the exhibition brings up absolutely, this was so much destruction, so much suffering, so much loss, so much repression in this one orbit. Definitely that story is there. But there are images in the exhibition, especially in the anti-religious alphabet section, where they Mikhail Cheremnikh, one of the artists, really lambasts the Western powers for being colonial, for being racist, for being imperialist. It's not a pretty story either, I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we'll open it up to comments and questions.
Hi, Dr. Elaine Davies. Thank you. Wonderful exhibit. Can't wait for the conference in June. When I was a student in Leningrad at the beginning of the 70s, I remember going to the Atheism Museums. So this was really wonderful to see. And I started the first line of my dissertation about the Kazan icon being flown around Leningrad.
Great.
So, but I have a follow-up question to World War II, because you have that wonderful exhibit with the instead of a beautiful corner, having the atheist posters in public spaces. During World War II, did you see a reverse? Did you see public spaces having icon walls again?
Is that Kathy speaking?
No, it's Elaine Davies.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, sorry. It's nice. There we go. Okay. That's a really interesting, and I honestly don't know the answer to that. It may be that there's just still a dearth of fine-grained information about actually what happened in the war. There are big stories of that kind about the Kazan Mother of God in the plain and the churches opening, but I've not seen any visual documentation of something at that level. Have you?
No,
Have-
no, this was amazing to me. I didn't really think about the walls of propaganda. And so then I thought, wow, was it reversed during the war?
Be reversed. Yeah. I mean, in some ways it would make sense, wouldn't it? Maybe and I also wonder, you're also raising the question, well, does this mean they have to mothball all their godless walls and while they're pursuing this other temporary measure? You're actually raising questions, I think, that deserve answer about what was the lived experience of people in public space during these 4 or 5 years before the directives are given. Okay, that's over. We're back on track again. I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. One of the questions that Laura had put together, and Amy, was to do with whether people, while conforming in public, people who remained in the Soviet Union, while conforming to how they were expected to behave in their public lives, maintained private lives of devotion and continued to be, to practice their faith. And I think there are many, many examples of that. I mean, I think that was absolutely the norm for many people. There's even a fascinating online conversation that's been going on for years now about whether Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, like an atheist poster child for the regime, whether he was secretly a believer. There's a whole conversation that goes on around that. And they said, well, his grandmother was a believer and she took him to church, but was he really a believer? And so, it's a very fluid situation, because I think in many people's lives, it was fluid, a compromise between what you had to do to get along and what you were able to do in private. And that's what you're saying about hiding your archive at home very much bears that out, I think.
Last thing I want to ask you, Wendy, is what is the biggest takeaway you hope people who see the exhibit upstairs go home with?
Actually, I find that the most difficult question at all, because I didn't really start out with an idea of a takeaway. I just pieced, duct taped things together, and then it turned into an exhibition. But I think the most interesting thing actually is a reminder of how we forget things. And this was a central part of Soviet reality that was well known for a long time, and then it was forgotten. And I think there's something to learn from the fact of how easily we forget things like this. And right now it happens to be interesting and seems relevant to remember it right now, because there's this antagonism between Russia and the rest of the world, and now we're remembering this stuff. But I don't know, I think keeping these memories alive, this knowledge alive in a critical way, is perhaps that's maybe what I would like people to come away thinking about, just how complicated our shared histories are and what we remember and what we forget.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for your time tonight and for the wonderful work you did. It's a fabulous exhibit, and I hope everyone will take the time to really go through it and enjoy the refreshments we have outside.